Good morning, everyone. My name is Peter Fotos. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the Heartland Institute here in Chicago. And welcome to the public policy session for the 4th International Conference on Climate Change. We've got a great panel, all state elected officials. Can I have a show of hands, how many people are state elected officials in the room? Or elected? Hey, awesome. Just a quick announcement before I forget later on. Tonight, you probably have already been told, but there is a legislator dinner at 6:30. It's a buffet in the Avenue Room, which is on the 4th floor. Love to see everybody there. I think everybody's already been told, but if you haven't, it's going to be a good event. All the speakers are also attending as well, so there will be about 150 people in the room. Good place to network, chat, and have a good time. And there's nothing really formal about it, no presentations, but it'll be a nice, relaxing event. I'd like to start off by introducing our three speakers. We have Pamela Gorman, who, did you have to retire to run, or did you retire to run?
We call it resigning.
Resign. All right. Senator Pamela Gorman, I'm not going to change the title, who's running for Congress. Served in the Arizona State Senate, but also in the Arizona House as well, right? And recently served as Majority Whip in the Arizona State Senate. She's a member of the Heartland Institute's Legislative Forum and has been in leadership with the National Conference on State Legislatures, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and the Republican Legislative Campaign Committee. She is a passionate advocate for free markets and limited government. She is credited with leading the charge to oppose and ultimately defeat the state-level version of cap-and-trade legislation in Arizona. So please, everybody, welcome Pamela Gorman.
Can I shut this without messing up your mojo? Okay. Wow, that's a good way to start. Good morning. I am Pamela Gorman, and I speak from old-fashioned note cards. I guess I'm electronically involved, but I still like to have something in my hand, so excuse me, I'm not going to have a fancy display. But the topic I'm here to talk to you about, I think is very important. And as he said, I've been a legislator for several years, and I've been watching the energy discussion take on more and more importance, but less and less attention is being given to it. And it's almost as if the religion of the left of environmentalism has gotten so deep into America's fiber, if you will, that it's almost been accepted. And I'm not going to give you a political speech today, so you can kind of all relax. I'm running for Congress, and that's what I spend a lot of my time doing. But I think what is really important for you all to know, especially since it looks like there's a lot of lawmakers in the room, is that the issue of the future of America's energy absolutely cannot be left to the pundits. It can't be left to the zealots on the left that truly want to push their religion of environmentalism so far down the throats of Americans that they don't even remember anymore what the argument was about. And you may have heard discussion just since you've been here that only about 33% of Americans still believe that global warming is man-made. But it does strike me as odd then that all of the policies to fix man-made global warming continue to go forward. They've disconnected, if you will, the discussion of the science completely from the discussion of the policy. And as policymakers yourselves and people who pay attention to what's going on in the world, it's our responsibility to bring back common sense because it's so important to our economy, it's important to our national security, and there is truly an energy crisis in America, and I'll talk to you more about that as we go down the line here. There is some legislation that you keep hearing about. You've heard it mentioned here today. They call it cap and trade. Everybody's heard of cap and trade, right? This isn't something I have to explain to this crowd. We like to call it cap and tax. And the reason for that, I think, is pretty obvious. And you keep hearing, oh, no, they're not going to be able to do it. They're not going to be able to do it. Well, I want to remind you that a couple of weeks before the health care reform bill was very quickly shuttled into law, the same people that are saying cap and tax can't happen this year were saying the same thing about health care. In fact, I was over at Capitol Hill visiting with some members, and they were all kind of saying, whew, dodge that bullet, health care's not going to happen, they'll never get their votes. I'd like to warn you all that anything is possible with this group. I think when you look at what President Obama, Pelosi, and Reid are actually willing to do to get their policies through, you're going to see cap and tax come back, and it may come back even uglier than we originally imagined. We've got to make sure that doesn't happen. And you've got to be on the forefront of that. There's only a handful of legislators in the states talking about it. Obviously, a couple gentlemen here to my right are aware of the importance. In Arizona, our previous governor got us involved in the Western Climate Initiative, which I understand is the topic of one of my cohorts here, so I'm not going to go into details. But we tried for years afterwards to pull back out of that. She got us involved through an illegal mechanism following a lawsuit with one of our private industries. Never had approval of the legislature, yet they had us on the edge of having to adhere to policies coming out of the World Climate Initiative. And I give you that picture not because it's actually directly related to what I'm going to talk about, which is my proposal for a sound energy policy for America. But you need to understand that the way they're working is not always the most direct and obvious route. So you need to be very alert. Put up a Google alert so anything related to energy policy comes to your inbox, because they're going to try to work around the edges, and I believe we will be caught off guard once again when this policy comes on the forefront and they seem about 10 times better prepared to deal with it than we are. So I encourage you to stay involved. The problem with these policies is not just the obvious. If you're reading the materials from this particular conference, you all know what it does to the economy, what it does to jobs in America, what it does to people in the lower income levels as their basics of life become so expensive they can no longer afford them. The people in the middle class no longer can afford to be in the middle class, and they get shoved down to the lower class and end up on our welfare rolls. The unhealthy cycle of this type of policy is one to be frightened of enough. But my bigger concern, and the one that you don't hear a lot of people talking about, is what happens to our freedom. In America, we enjoy a tremendous amount of freedom, unlike any place else on earth. And if you love this country, you know what I mean when you say having our government not be so heavily centralized like it is in socialist countries gives us a lot of freedom with our local control. And we talk a lot about states' rights and the need to break up the power of the federal government. Well, I would propose that the energy policies of this administration will go further to centralize power at the helm of the federal government than any other policies in the past that you've seen. And yes, they're all unconstitutional. We all know that. But that hasn't stopped them before, and I don't believe it'll stop them this time. And that's why we have to be on alert, making sure we understand the arguments against, but more importantly, having ideas that are better. We can't just continue to say no to their bad ideas. And I'm going to give you today what I believe is a good idea for energy in America's future that will not only allow us to continue to provide the energy we need in the future for our own industries and families, but will also protect us in terms of national security. We can't continue to be dependent on our enemies, the people that want to wipe us clean off the earth for all of our energy. And the policies coming out of Washington are doing all of they can to make us more and more dependent on those foreign sources. Now, under what is being planned, you're looking at an effort in D.C. to put a small handful of elitists that are loyal to the Obama administration in charge of the energy. And when I say in charge, what I mean is through the cap and trade schemes and things, the government will actually have the ability, in the end, to say who gets energy and who doesn't, who has to be regulated more than others. Maybe they'll have favorite companies, favorite industries that they'll favor. When government starts being able to pick the winners and losers in something that is so elemental to our way of life as energy, you have given that small group of people the ultimate power, the keys to the kingdom, if you will. That is frightening, and that's why it affects your freedom. I think that centralizing the power in any capacity is dangerous. I think under this administration, it's downright frightening. Now, that said, I wouldn't have been okay with this under Bush. I wouldn't even have been comfortable with this under Reagan. There is no president that will ever be elected in the United States that should have this type of power under their control. It's un-American, and it's freedom-crushing. And we have got to stop it and recognize that this sleeper issue has got to come to the forefront. And I'm not going to give an election speech, as I said, but I do want to just remind you that elections have consequences. And I hope you'll keep that in mind going forward. Now, as we said, most Americans no longer believe in man-made global warming. They're not fooled by the alarmist theories of Michael Moore and Al Gore. Really, it's kind of egotistical for man to think that he has some kind of power to stop the natural cycles of Earth. And to be honest, I don't know about you, but if we were going to be able to do that, I think we'd start with earthquakes, tsunamis, things like that. I don't think we'd start right out with slight temperature changes. But that said, they've disconnected that discussion, and they've just started talking about how we can tax this industry to make it better for America. But they've disconnected it for why it's better. They don't even have to talk about it anymore. And we all have accepted that there is a reason to have policies for cleaner energy, even though we've disconnected from the idea that our energy use is affecting global warming. Do you see why there's a disconnect there? You've got to help us reconnect it. Does anybody in this room really believe that by taxing Americans into oblivion, we're somehow going to stop the Earth's natural cycles? Is there anybody here? Oh, good. I thought we were going to have an intervention later, if you did. Unfortunately, there are people that do, and this is probably not their venue, so that's why you don't see them here. The groups that want to control the power in America use the crisis, if you will, that was invented by the Al Gore thinking as a tool to institute horrendous policies. In fact, Rahm Emanuel is somewhat famous for his phrase, never let a good crisis go to waste. It's your opportunity to do big things. I believe the big things they want to do is to centralize the power and ultimately turn our country into a more socialist nation than it ever has before, more so than our founding fathers intended, but certainly farther than any of our current people in America would accept or appreciate. But if they do it under the covering of a crisis, an energy crisis, they might be able to just get away with it, and that we cannot allow to happen. They've got strategy they've got to follow to get there, though. One is they've already done, which is to get everyday Americans believing certain things that are simply not true. But they've got to get this cap and tax through. They've got to prevent us from tapping into our natural resources, because remember, if we could tap into our natural resources, we wouldn't be nearly as dependent on the foreign oil. They've got to get us to a place where we have a higher demand than we have supply in America with our own energy resources. And the third thing they have to do, which they've already done, is to dramatically and inappropriately expand the powers of the EPA. You may have heard about some of the things the EPA is doing. This is probably a crowd where you actually read these type of things. But they've declared carbon dioxide a pollutant. When you declare a naturally occurring gas that every human being expels a pollutant, you really can control every human being, because we're all pollutant makers, every single one of us in this room. I don't know if the trees and the crops in America and around the world are aware that we're trying to stomp out carbon dioxide. If they had a voice, I'm sure they'd complain. But when we do things the things they're trying to do to make these three things come into play, they're going to drive up the costs of everything. And we're in a recession. So when you drive up the cost of all of your energy bills, which affects your food and your prescriptions and your groceries, every single consumer good is actually made with energy. So if you think about it in those terms, your entire way of life is affected by the cost of energy. So if they can affect the cost of energy, they can, in effect, control everything in your life. And I hope that scares you a little, because it should. We are in a recession, as I don't have to remind you. The absolute last thing we should be doing is driving up costs for Americans on very basic needs in their lives. One of the things that I find interesting they've done is they've stopped using the word global warming. They've moved to climate change. And I know in these conferences we've discussed how tremendously smart that was of them. If the only constant is change, then anytime there's change, they claim victory, that they were right. See, we were right. It's changing again. And every time something changes, they say, see, it's time for us to put our agenda into place. We can't allow them to claim the argument. We can't allow them to frame the argument, rather, that change is somehow an indicator of a need to regulate energy in America. Now, I want to be clear, we do have an energy crisis, but it's not the type you've heard of. The energy crisis in America is really twofold. One, we don't have enough of it. With a growing country and a growing demand, how many people here have little electric gadgets on them right now? Everybody does. Our whole lives have become, except for my note cards, everything in our lives has become dependent on electricity. The more dependent we are for our information flow alone, the more power they have over us. That is a real problem. That is a real crisis. The second real part of the crisis is our national security. When our enemies have complete control over our ability to get enough energy to power our lives the way Americans have become accustomed, then we're stuck bowing to them. And we're not a nation that should be forced to bow to any other nation. We certainly shouldn't be doing it for something as simple as energy when we have so much energy right here at home. The reason it matters is because you won't be able to provide for your families. It'll affect our economy and, again, our national security. We've got to get our government to do the right thing. And I have a very simple solution for our federal government, and that is this: just get out of the way. If federal government would just get out of the way, American ingenuity would be free to flourish, take over, and we would see more than enough natural resources coming out of America's domestic lands and offshore, yes, offshore. But government, under the current administration, is doing everything it can to stop America from tapping into her natural resource. Why would they do that? It's a good question. Some smart journalist should ask that question. What is the motivation? If we could tap in, we would put people back to work, put them to work in the mines, put them to work going after the oil shale, put them to work working on the oil rigs, both on land and offshore. There's a lot of good jobs out there in energy. There's also the compounding effect in our economy, because other people are put to work by those dollars going into the economy. We've got to get more Americans back to work, and I believe that my energy plan will put people back to work and help the economy, and of course, in the end, secure a better national security for all Americans. My approach to energy plan is not picking winners and losers. I've heard several people talk. You have the coal people come in and tell you all about coal. And you hear the oil people come in and talk to you all about oil. The natural gas people talk to you all about natural gas. And then you always have your fringe, wind and solar people. I believe it's an all-of-the-above approach. So the Gorman energy plan, you could shorthand refer to as all of the above. And the reason for that is we have a tremendous energy need, and I don't believe any one sector can provide the energy we need, and certainly not an affordable price. Oil and coal being the most affordable energy sources have to be supplemented by those that are a little more expensive. But you notice I didn't say subsidized. I said supplemented, and that's an important thing to remember. So the first part of my energy portfolio that I would propose is nuclear. Any nuclear fans in the room? Oh, good. If you haven't, I encourage you to actually go and take a foot tour of Yucca Mountain. It's really interesting. It's a side note, but I've actually done that tour, and I can't think of any good reason why Nevada is not doing whatever. Get some super highways out of it if you must, but they should be using that facility. It's a very safe, almost like God himself put it there as a place to safely store nuclear waste. But today's nuclear plants are not being built in America. It's nearly impossible because of government regulations. Yet it's clean, has zero emissions, and makes a ton of clean energy. France is actually leading the way. They do a lot of clean, modernized nuclear energy. Now think about that. France is ahead of America. That's just annoying. I don't like that. We need to start building more modern nuclear plants now. They take a while to get online. It's a long-term strategy, but we've got to start now. Government needs to what? Get out of the way, exactly. The second point in our portfolio of energy would be ANWR. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge up in Alaska is a place where there is so much oil available on America's soil, but yet we can't drill there. Because of why? Because the government's in the way. Governor Palin had a lot of press, particularly on this issue, and rightly so. She was the governor of the state. She's very much into conservation of Alaskan wildlife, and she probably knows better than anyone what would happen if we put drilling rigs in ANWR. And what she says will happen is nothing. She says the wildlife is very adaptable. It'll just learn to live around it. So if that's the case, why won't they allow us to drill in ANWR? It's a good question. Some smart journalists should ask that. If they start drilling there, it would produce as much oil a day as the state of Texas. It would bring in $200 billion in revenues into our debt-ridden nation. Wouldn't it be terrific to get revenues from drilling in ANWR instead of borrowing it from China? Seems like it would be a much better way to go. If they were to start drilling there, it would become the single largest oil field in the Northern Hemisphere. So when you hear people talking about ANWR and you think, why is it such a big deal? That's why it's such a big deal. It's not just that there's oil there, it's that there is enough oil there to keep America going for a very long time, and there's really no good reason not to drill there. We need to drill ANWR now. Government needs to get out of the way. The third part of my portfolio would be oil shale. Has anybody here read about oil shale? You familiar with the reserves we have? Terrific. Right now, there's a prohibition on going after it because it's sitting on national land and they can't get leases to properly go in and explore and extract it. But they say there's probably 2 trillion barrels of oil there. That's 7 times the amount of crude oil in Saudi Arabia, just to give you an idea. It's enough to meet the U.S. demands for oil for the next 250 years. Our country needs energy. We've got to tap into our oil shale reserves. All right, I like that. What does government need to do here? Get out of the way, exactly. The fourth point in my all of the above portfolio is offshore oil. Yes, I'm going to go out on a limb and say we should continue to drill offshore. Now, the Gulf spill is truly a tragedy. 11 lives lost. That's not something you just ignore, although the national press has largely ignored that. Lives were lost, families were affected. There's oil spilling into the Gulf. It is a tragedy. The cleanup is going on now, and they're trying to stop it. I heard just today on the elevator, I read the little headline there. They're starting to slow it, and that's terrific. But that spill should not derail going forward offshore drilling. But what it should do is a couple things. One, we don't really know what caused it yet. Agreed? We just know everybody's pointing fingers, but nobody really knows what caused it. They're just trying to figure out how to stop it, and then they'll kind of look into that. But what we should learn from this is that when there's safety measures that have been required under the law, for instance, having the proper equipment in place to do a quick burn-off if there should be a leak, if the companies aren't adhering to that, well, that's an enforcement issue. And I'm from Arizona, so I can tell you all about the federal government not enforcing things. But when it comes to this oil spill, we should learn from this. Going forward, I would think the industry is suffering such a black eye that just through the natural corrections of public relations nightmares, you will see that equipment in place at every offshore drilling site in the future. That's how the free market works. It's a beautiful thing. But we do already have the law in place. It needs to be enforced. I don't think a series of new arduous regulations that could price drilling oil offshore completely out of the market is the answer. Enforcing the current regulations that make sense for safety is the answer. The other thing that nobody's talking about, before this actually happened, I was looking into developing my position statement and learning more about our relationship with Israel. And somebody that was very well versed in this said that in order to stop Iran's attacks, the only way we can really do that is to stop their gasoline. With all of their oil, apparently they don't have gasoline. And it was suggested to me that any direction we would make going that way would maybe put our own oil production at risk, that Iran and their friends might decide to attack American oil production in order to make a statement, basically, about what they would feel about us inserting ourselves against Iran. I'm not standing here saying that I think Iran bombed the offshore oil rig. What I'm saying is they could. They could go and bomb a lot of our energy resources. When you go to a nuclear reaction site, they have very, very strict shoot-on-site directions. They have special teams of people that are just there to defend our nuclear reactors. I believe that oil, being highly flammable, could do damage to the environment that is very expensive to clean up, lives could be lost. It deserves the type of national defense that we employ at our nuclear reactors, and I would encourage the federal government going forward to consider putting the proper defense in place. This may have been an accident, the next one might not be. But what we need to do with offshore oil is make it safe, make sure best practices are being followed, and then essentially don't try to overmanage this. Don't respond to the crisis reactively and shove an industry out. And here's one of the reasons. Even if we were to, because we're scared politically, I don't get that scared politically, but a lot of people in Washington do. Now, if they back off and they stop American companies from drilling offshore, do you think that's going to keep China and Russia from drilling offshore, right off the shore of Florida? Absolutely not. It doesn't make sense to tell American companies no because we're scared of the political fallout of an accident in the Gulf, and yet know that other countries are going to be down there doing the same thing. Regardless of the political response, we need to keep drilling offshore, but we need to do it safer and better, and we need to make sure that in the future we're protected. One of the things that we often run into is a discussion of coal. Now, in my home state of Arizona, we have a lot of coal, but our country as a whole has a lot of coal. That's kind of fun to say. We have 1.1 billion tons, second only to China. I've often heard America referred to as the Saudi Arabia of coal. Coal produces right now roughly half of the electricity used by Americans. It's important. The idea of shutting down this industry for political reasons is ridiculous. We can't allow it to happen. We need people put to work. We need to mine now, not just the amount we're doing, but we need to mine no more. And how do we do that? We need to get government out of the way. Natural gas, cleanest burning fossil fuel we know. 7 years ago, our demand exceeded our supply. And what had happened? Russia decided this might be a great opportunity to join forces with Iran and Algeria and some other not-so-friendly companies and create their own little OPEC-style control over the natural gas reserves. But thanks to American ingenuity and new methods of collection, we now are far outpacing and have all the natural gas we need. That is American ingenuity, if allowed to flourish without government tampering. I think we need more of that, not less. Don't you agree? And the last part of my portfolio, my time's about up, is going to seem crazy to say, but yes, we do need green technologies out there. But we can't do it through picking winners and losers through heavily subsidized programs. Let the market work. If there is an alternative energy source out there that can actually come to the market, be sold at an amount consumers can afford, then I say let it go forward. But all the government should be doing is making sure that the tax policies and the regulation of those industries are not so arduous that they can't flourish. And again, in green energy, we just need to get out of the way. I'm going to cut my comments short, but I just want to say that with an all-of-the-above approach, I really believe America can gain her independence from the foreign nations that hate us most. And I think we have to do it. It's how we bring jobs to America. It's how we increase the output and make our economy healthy again. But it's our national security at its core and our very freedom that's at stake. Thank you. I'm Pamela Gorman. Thanks.